Carnegie Hall in New York City, the home of the world's greatest musical events. Today's event is one in a series of New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein. And here is Mr. Bernstein.
Now that's what you call a pretty tune, isn't it? Sort of like a folk song. Perhaps it makes you think of a song you may have learned in school or at camp. Somehow it has that folk song flavor, like something a lot of people might sing together in a bus or on a hike or around the campfire. But it's not sung in any of those places. It's not even sung at all. It's played by a clarinet, as you just heard, and it comes from a symphony by Mozart. Maybe that surprises you, because it seems so simple and natural, not like the kind of complicated, grand stuff we usually think of as being in a symphony. But folk songs and folk dances are really the heart of all music, the very beginning of music. And you'd be amazed at how much of the big, complicated concert music we hear grows right out of them. What is folk music anyway? Well, you see, folk music expresses the nature of a people. You can almost always tell something about a certain people simply by listening to their folk songs. Of course, most of the folk songs we know belong to the past, when the different peoples of the earth were more separate from one another, and their characters and different natures were easier to tell apart. Now, sometimes these folk songs reflect the climate of a certain country, or they may tell us something about the geography of a country, or even they may tell us something about what the people do mostly, like being shepherds or cowboys or miners or whatever. But most important of all, folk songs reflect the rhythms and accents and speeds of the way people talk, the way a particular people talks. In other words, their language, especially the language of their poetry, sort of grows into musical sounds. And those speaking rhythms and accents finally pass from folk music into what we call art music or opera or concert music of any particular people. And that's what makes Tchaikovsky sound Russian, or what makes Verdi sound Italian, or what makes Gershwin sound American. It all comes from the folk music, which in turn comes first of all from the way we speak. And that's the important thing we have to learn about today. For instance, take a Hungarian folk song. It begins like this. Jöjjön haza kedves anyám, jöjjön haza kedves anyám. Now, why do we know immediately that that's a Hungarian tune? I mean, besides the fact that it's got Hungarian words, it's because the Hungarian language has a strange thing about it. Almost all the words in it are accented on the first syllable. Jöjjön, haza, édes, anya. That's how you can always tell a Hungarian speaking English, because he always says, I don't understand because I am Hungarian. And that same accent naturally pops up in the music. Bum, 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 bum. All the stresses belong at the beginning. And so it's just as natural when a great Hungarian composer like Béla Bartók writes his music that he should compose in that same accent. Just listen to this tune from his Bartok's beautiful piece called Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta. You see how that tune is like a string of words in a sentence, each one with a big accent at the beginning on the first syllable. And that's not even folk music anymore. It's already moved into the concert hall. But the same thing is true of all music. It grows out of people's folk music, which first grew out of their language. Look at French, for instance. French is a language that has almost no strong accents at all. Almost every syllable in it is equal, not in length, but in stress, in accent. Like, permettez-moi de vous présenter Monsieur Bernstein. Now, the minute you hear somebody say, permettez-moi de vous présenter Monsieur Bernstein, then you know he's no Frenchman. All the syllables have to be alike in stress. And these equal stresses show up just as clearly in French folk music. You know this charming French folk song. Il était un petit navire, il était un petit navire, qui n'avait jamais navigué, qui n'avait jamais navigué, ohé, ohé. You see how equal all those syllables are, just the opposite of the Hungarian song, because it's all smooth and even. Il était un petit navire. And that's exactly the smoothness and evenness that we hear in French concert music, like this phrase from Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. All smooth. And so it goes through all the languages. Italian, for instance, is famous for its long, beautiful vowels. Volare, cantare, oh, ho, ho, ho. And so Italian music lingers on the vowels. But Spanish, on the other hand, doesn't linger so much on the vowels. The consonants are more important. Para bailar la bamba se necesita un poco de gracia y otra cosita. And so the folk music comes out crisp and rhythmic, just like the language. Para bailar la bamba se necesita un poco de gracia y otra cosita. Y arriba, y arriba, y arriba, ya. And German, of course, is a very heavy language with long words and long combinations of sounds. Like, soll ich schlürfen, untertauschen, süßen Düften mich verrauschen? And so German music tends to be heavier and longer and more, well, self-important than, say, French or Spanish music. And as for English, well, that depends on what kind of English you're talking about. English is one thing. And the folk songs from England are unmistakable, tripping and light and quick with the tongue, just the way the British speak, like this one. As I was going to Strawberry Fair, singing, singing, buttercups and daisies, I met a lady taking her where for dee. Her eyes were blue and gold in her hair as we were going to Strawberry Fair. Rifle, rifle, foddle, riddle, rido, rifle, rifle, foddle, riddle, dee. Now, well, what kind of English is this? And when I die, you can bury me beneath the western sky. What is that? On the lone prairie. What kind of English is that? Huh? American, but what kind of American? Western, right, cowboy. And you see how different the music is, too, how lazy and drawling, completely different from the British. And just as different is the English of New York City, with its slapdash syncopations and its kind of tough charm. I got the horse right here, the name's Paul Revere. That has another kind of English, and so it's another kind of music. Well, all this is fascinating, but it still doesn't explain that Mozart tune we started with, which is easily explained. It's the middle part of the minuet, or the third movement of Mozart's symphony in E flat. And the thing that makes that tune so enchanting is not that it's a folk tune, but that it's like a folk tune, an Austrian one this time. The melody has all the creamy sweetness of Austrian speech. And what's more, in the first part of the minuet, you will also hear some of those Tyrolean hoop-tsa-tsas, you know, those thigh-slapping things that you get in the mountainous music of Austria. Bing, bing, dum, makes that folk music so famous. And so now, here is that whole minuet now, real highbrow concert music by Mozart, which could never have been written if the simple Austrian folk music hadn't come first. Now we're going to take a big jump from Austria all the way to Mexico. And this will bring us even closer to real folk music, not just music that's sort of like folk music, as we heard in this Mozart minuet, but music that is really based on old melodies and rhythms of the Mexican Indians. This is a short symphony in one movement only by the famous Mexican composer Carlos Chavez, and it's called Indian Symphony, or in Spanish, Sinfonía India. Perhaps the most wonderful thing about this exciting piece is the rhythms you'll hear in it. All kinds of rhythms, regular and irregular, in 2s and 3s and 5s and 7s, and every combination. We're not dealing anymore with little French songs or British ditties or cowboy laments. This stuff goes way, way back to a very old Indian civilization, which we now call primitive. Of course, we have very little idea of what their language sounded like way back then, but we can almost tell by listening to this music. It's choppy, unemotional, almost wooden, like Indians. In other words, primitive. But primitive music can be very thrilling, even if it's also quite limited. You see, it's usually just 5 notes, sometimes 6, over and over again, the same 5 or 6 notes, usually these. I'm sure you've heard all kinds of folk music from all over the world that use those 5 notes. Old Chinese music, or Scotch bagpipe music. Only those 5 notes. And you can find it in African music or certain Hindu music, Malayan music, all over the place. Those 5 notes, and that's called a pentatonic scale. Now, here are the same 5 notes again, only this time they're Mexican Indians. Now, that's the first theme from this Indian symphony we're going to hear. And at first you might just say, so what? How boring to have to listen to the same 5 notes all the time, never changing. But that's just the wonderful part, that Chavez takes these simple primitive scales and makes them not just interesting, but so exciting you want to jump out of your seat. And he does it through his imagination, by the way he puts the notes together, and by the marvelous rhythms he uses, like this section at the beginning. Now, of course, a lot of the excitement comes from the way he uses the orchestra. He has a whole gang of Indian drums and rattles and strings and things like this. And in addition to that, he has a xylophone that seems to have a primitive life of its own. It keeps going on no matter what the rest of the orchestras play with this. And then there are very strange shrieks and whistles that occur in the woodwinds. And of course, there are also some lovely melodies that Chavez makes out of his 5 or 6 notes. In fact, there's one you may all go out whistling. And there's a dance at the very end that builds up to such a pitch of excitement by repeating and repeating that I wouldn't be surprised to turn around at the end and find you all swinging in the aisles. Here is the Sinfonía India by Carlos Chavez. That is a thriller, isn't it? Well, so far, we have heard a Mozart minuet that is not folk music, but has a family resemblance to it, let's say, and a Mexican symphony that uses real folk music, rhythms and notes, but no actual folk melodies. See, Chavez wrote all those tunes himself. But now, at last, we're going to hear real folk songs, preserved just as fresh as the day they were born in that ancient region of France called the Auvergne. Now, even the language they're sung in is the same old dialect, part French, part Spanish, part who knows what, that the shepherds and peasants spoke up there in those mountains centuries ago. These songs from the Auvergne have been collected for almost 40 years by a French composer named Canteloube, who has a special passion for the folk music of his country. And it was arranged orchestra accompaniments for the songs that are almost as beautiful and touching as the folk songs themselves. And now I have the great pleasure of presenting to you Miss Marnie Nixon, a beautiful young soprano, who will sing 3 of these songs for you.
That last song was a love song sung by a young farm girl to her lover. In this next song, the same girl sits down to her spinning wheel and spins. And she says, When I was a little girl, I used to watch the sheep. And then she spins a little and she makes fast little spinning sounds. Then she says, there was a shepherd with me, and he helped me watch the sheep. He asked me for a kiss, and out of gratitude, I gave him 2. Then she spins again and says, And the last song is a bit of carefree philosophy. It says, unhappy is the man who has a woman. Unhappy is the man who doesn't have a woman. And he who has a woman doesn't want one, and he who doesn't have one wants one.
And now, we're going to hear a marvelous piece to finish the program with that sums up all the things we've been talking about. A piece with folk spirit, like the Mozart Minuet, and folkish material like the Chavez Symphony, but also with real folk tunes quoted as exactly as those folk songs of the Auvergne that we just heard. This time it's an American piece by a salty old Yankee named Charles Ives, who lived up to his death a few years ago in Danbury, Connecticut. He was one of the first American composers to use folk songs and folk dances in his concert music. It was his way of being American, to take marching tunes and hymns and patriotic songs and popular country fiddle music and develop them all together into big symphonic works. Now, the piece we're going to hear is the last movement of his Second Symphony, and before it's finished, you will have heard tunes that sound like barn dance music and tunes that sound like Stephen Foster melodies, like Swanee River, and tunes that sound like fife and drum music. But more than all this, you will also have heard real barn dance tunes, like Turkey in the Straw, which you all know, and real folk songs such as Long, Long Ago. You know that one? And a real Stephen Foster tune called the Camptown Races. You know that one. And a real bugle call, Reveille. And to top it all off, a long quotation from that grand old American tune, Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, which I guess you know too. It all adds up to a rousing sort of jamboree, like a 4th of July celebration, finished off at the very end by a wild yelp of laughter by the whole orchestra, made by playing a chord of all the notes in the rainbow at once, like this. That's the finish. It's as if to say, wow! It's a perfect piece for ending this series of programs, which have been very exciting for us to present to you. We hope you found them exciting too, and we're happy to say we'll be back with you for another series next year. And now, here is the final movement of the Second Symphony by Charles Ives.
Carnegie Hall, another in the New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts, under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein.